30,000 feet above the dark Atlantic, 280 passengers were 10 minutes away from being blown out of the sky by their own military. Two heavily armed F-35 fighter jets had missile lock. The cabin was screaming. The pilots were paralyzed. Then, a woman in seat 4A unbuckled her belt, walked into the cockpit, and quietly changed history. Flight 772, a Boeing 777-300ER, operated by Transatlantic Airlines, was supposed to be a routine red-eye from London to New York. At 2:14 a.m., the aircraft was cruising at 35,000 feet, roughly 200 miles off the eastern seaboard of the United States. In the cabin, the lights were dimmed to a deep twilight blue. Most of the passengers were asleep, lulled into unconsciousness by the steady, hypnotic drone of the massive GE-90 engines. In seat 4A of first class, Evelyn Reed was awake. Dressed in a faded leather jacket and a plain black t-shirt, Evelyn didn't look like someone who had spent the last decade dropping precision munitions over hostile territory. She looked like a tired commuter. Her eyes were fixed on the glowing screen of her e-reader, but her mind was cataloguing the subtle physics of the flight. It was a habit she couldn't break: the feeling of the deck angle, the exact pitch of the engines, the faint vibrations traveling through the floorboards. Up front, in the flight deck, Captain William Kessler was sipping lukewarm coffee and fighting heavy eyelids. Kessler was a 22-year veteran of the skies, a man who had flown through typhoons over the Pacific and blizzards in Anchorage. Beside him sat First Officer Ryan Hayes, a bright, ambitious 28-year-old who was currently inputting their descent parameters into the Flight Management Computer, FMC. "Boston Center just handed us off," Hayes said, adjusting his headset. "Clear weather in JFK. We should be on the ground in 40 minutes. "Copy that," Kessler muttered, rubbing his eyes. Then, the primary flight displays flickered. It wasn't a loss of power. The screens didn't go black. They strobed, a violent burst of digital static, before resetting. Kessler sat up straight, his coffee spilling onto his uniform pants. "What the hell was that?" Hayes tapped his keypad, frowning. I don't know. FMC just rebooted. Captain, the waypoints are gone." Kessler reached for his yoke to disengage the autopilot and fly manually, a standard procedure when the navigation computers threw an error. But as his hands gripped the leather-wrapped wheel, it went rigid. The autopilot disconnect button didn't respond. "Ryan, I have no manual control. The fly-by-wire is locked out. Trying to reset the breakers," Hayes said, his voice rising in pitch. He reached overhead, flipping switches. Nothing happened. The aircraft was entirely unresponsive. Suddenly, the Boeing 777 violently banked 30 degrees to the left. The nose pitched down into a steep, aggressive descent. In the cabin, the sudden negative G-force threw sleeping passengers against their seatbelts. Coffee cups shattered in the aisles. Oxygen masks rattled in their compartments. Screams erupted as the massive airliner plummeted from 35,000 feet to 25,000 feet in a matter of seconds. Evelyn Reed didn't scream. She closed her e-reader and looked out the window. She watched the wing spoilers deploy, forcing the plane down, and calculated the bank angle, 30 degrees. Rapid descent to exactly 25,000. Leveling off. This wasn't a mechanical failure. Mechanical failures were sloppy. This was a tactical evasion profile. The plane was purposefully ducking below the primary commercial radar coverage corridors. In the cockpit, Kessler was sweating profusely, hauling back on the useless yoke with all his strength. "Mayday, mayday, mayday. This is Flight 772. We have lost flight controls." He yelled into his boom mic. "Dead air." "Transponder is off," Hayes shouted, his fingers flying across the comms panel. "Squawk 7,500. I can't punch it in. The system is overriding my inputs. Captain, the plane is flying itself. And look at the new heading." Kessler looked at the digital compass. The plane had turned sharply southwest. They were no longer heading for JFK. They were accelerating toward the heart of Washington, D.C., straight into the most heavily restricted airspace on the planet. 300 miles away, inside the darkened, screen-lit room of the Boston Air Route Traffic Control Center, Supervisor Greg Hiller stared at his radar scope in disbelief. Flight 772's data tag had just vanished. In its place was a primary radar return, a raw blip, moving fast and descending dangerously. "I've lost comms and telemetry on transatlantic. 772, a controller shouted down the row. Hiller grabbed his headset. "Flight 772, this is Boston Center. If you read me, identify." "Squawk ident." "Silence." "Sir," the controller said, his voice trembling. "They've altered course. They're heading directly for the capital at 500 knots. Hiller's blood ran cold. A heavy airliner, unresponsive, squawking nothing, deviating violently from its flight path toward Washington, D.C. The protocols for this exact scenario had been written in blood 2 decades ago. "Call NORAD," Hiller ordered, his voice hollow. "Tell them we have a rogue heavy." 10 minutes had passed. Inside the cabin of Flight 772, the initial panic had morphed into a suffocating, terrifying silence. Clara Jenkins, the lead flight attendant, was clutching the bulkhead phone, repeatedly buzzing the cockpit. There was no answer. Passengers were crying softly, holding on to their loved ones, while others desperately tried to get a signal on their cell phones. Evelyn unbuckled her seatbelt. The seatbelt sign was still glaring red, but she ignored it. She stood up, perfectly balanced, despite the slight turbulence, and walked over to Clara. "Ma'am, please sit down," Clara hissed, her eyes wide with terror. "How long has the cockpit been unresponsive?" Evelyn asked. Her voice was infuriatingly calm. It was a voice designed to cut through chaos. "I can't share that information. You need to take your seat now." Evelyn stepped closer, keeping her voice low. "Your plane is acting like a guided missile. The pilots are locked out of the avionics, which means someone or something hacked the fly-by-wire system. If we don't fix this in the next 3 minutes, we are going to be intercepted and shot down." Before Clara could process the absurdity of a passenger knowing this, a blinding light flooded the cabin. A collective shriek tore through the left side of the aircraft. Passengers slammed their hands against the windows, pointing out into the black night. Flying no more than 100 feet off the Boeing's left wing was a matte grey, aggressive wedge of military aviation. Blue fire pulsed from its rear exhaust. It was an F-35 Lightning II stealth fighter. A second F-35 appeared on the right side, boxing the airliner in. "Oh my God," Clara gasped, dropping the intercom phone. "Are those ours?" Evelyn looked at the fighter on the left wing. She recognized the tail flash in the moonlight. "Langley Air Force Base." "They're ours," Evelyn said grimly. "And they're not here to escort us." The F-35 on the left suddenly accelerated, cutting violently across the nose of the Boeing 777, a maneuver known as a headbutt. It was the universal military signal for "follow me or be destroyed." The Boeing didn't follow. The rogue computer simply kept the massive airliner plowing forward, unyielding, straight toward the restricted airspace. Evelyn knew the rules of engagement, row, better than anyone on this plane. She knew that the F-35 pilots were currently on a secure frequency with the Eastern Air Defense Sector. She knew that a general was looking at a map, watching a ghost plane barrel toward millions of sleeping civilians. And she knew that the order to arm weapons was mere seconds away. Evelyn reached into her leather jacket and pulled out a solid black metal card. It bore the crest of the Department of Defense and a highly classified Joint Special Operations Command identifier. She shoved it into Clara's hands. "My name is Major Evelyn Reed. Call the cockpit. Use the emergency override code. Tell the captain that if he doesn't open that door in 10 seconds, the missiles on those fighters will sever our wings." Clara, trembling uncontrollably, stared at the card, then at Evelyn's steel-cold eyes. She punched a 4-digit emergency sequence into the keypad next to the reinforced cockpit door. The buzzer sounded loud and shrill inside the flight deck. Inside the cockpit, Kessler and Hayes were in a state of absolute despair. They had tried everything, pulling the main bus breakers, manually cranking the trim, but the digital hijack was absolute. When the buzzer sounded, Kessler looked at the camera feed. He saw his lead flight attendant standing next to a woman holding a military ID. "Captain, the fighters just dropped back to our 6 o'clock, Hayes said, his voice cracking. "They're in firing position." Kessler unlocked the door. Evelyn stepped in and immediately slammed the heavy deadbolt shut behind her. She didn't look at Kessler or Hayes. She looked straight at the instrument panels, her eyes darting across the digital chaos of the glass cockpit. "Who the hell are you?" Kessler demanded. We have about 40 seconds before 2 aim. 9X sidewinders tear this fuselage in half, Evelyn said, leaning over the center pedestal. Your comms are jammed, correct? Everything is locked out, Hayes yelled. The radios? The transponder? Everything. Primary radios are tied to the avionics bus, Evelyn muttered, her hands moving with blinding speed over the lower console. She popped open a small maintenance panel that most commercial pilots went their entire careers without touching. But the VHF backup is isolated. It's hardwired to the emergency battery. I tried the backup, Kessler said. It's dead. It's not dead. It's being fed a spoofed impedance signal, Evelyn replied, ripping a clump of wires from the panel, exposing raw copper. She forcefully crossed 2 wires, creating a hard physical bypass. The backup radio screen sparked, flickered, and hummed to life. Frequency, Evelyn commanded. Hayes blinked. What? Put it on guard. 121.5. Now. Hayes fumbled with the dials, twisting them to 121.5 megahertzes, the International Aviation Distress Frequency. Behind them, the F-35s had perfectly aligned their targeting pods. In their helmets, the fighter pilots heard the high-pitched, sustained tone of a solid infrared lock. The order from NORAD had just come through. Clear to engage. Evelyn snatched the microphone from the console, bypassing the captain entirely. She didn't use the panicked tone of a civilian in distress. She used the cold, clipped cadence of a combat aviator. Interceptor lead. This is commercial heavy on your 12 o'clock. We are experiencing a hostile cyber takeover of flight controls. Do not fire. I repeat, hold your fire. Static crackled over the cockpit speakers. Then, a voice cut through. It was young, tense, and strictly professional. Unknown voice on guard. This is Air Defense Flight 0-1. You are penetrating restricted airspace. We have weapons lock. By order of the United States government, you are to divert immediately to heading 090, or you will be fired upon. We cannot comply. Flight 0-1, Evelyn fired back. The deck is locked out. We are passengers in this cockpit. Stand down. Negative. Heavy. I am ordered to splash you in 30 seconds. Who is this? Evelyn took a breath. She knew the fighter pilot wouldn't break his orders for a random voice. She needed a name drop that would paralyze the chain of command, something that would force the pilot to kick the decision all the way up to the commanding general of NORAD. 01, look at your telemetry, Evelyn said, her voice dropping to a low lethal register. Your squadron commander is Colonel David Mitchell, call sign Viper. A beat of absolute silence on the radio. Tell Viper, Evelyn said softly, but with enough command to rattle the glass, that Wraith is aboard, and if he shoots me down tonight, I'm going to haunt him for the rest of his miserable life. 01, say again. First Lieutenant Jack Riley's voice shook against the oxygen mask inside his F-35 cockpit. The targeting reticle on his helmet-mounted display was glowing a steady, lethal red. The Boeing 777 filled his canopy, a massive, helpless whale of metal illuminated by the moonlight. His thumb was hovering over the weapons release button on the hottest joystick. The AIM 9X missiles were armed, their seeker heads shrieking in his ears, locked onto the immense heat signature of the 777's right engine. I said, "Tell Viper that Wraith is aboard." The cold, unwavering female voice repeated over the emergency frequency. "You have 20 seconds, kid. Make the call." Riley swallowed hard. This violated every protocol in the manual, but the sheer authority in the woman's voice made his blood run cold. He keyed his encrypted tactical radio, patching directly to the Eastern Air Defense Sector, EADS, command bunker in Rome, New York. Anytime center, this is Air Defense 0-1. I have a solid lock on the Rogue Heavy, but, sir, an unidentified female in the cockpit is on guard frequency. She requested I relay a message to Colonel Mitchell. Riley paused, wincing at how absurd it sounded. She said, "Tell Viper that Wraith is aboard." 200 miles away, deep underground in a room bathed in the glow of massive radar screens, Colonel David Viper Mitchell was standing over the tactical plotting table. The room was a hive of controlled panic. A countdown clock on the wall showed exactly 3 minutes and 40 seconds until Flight 772 breached the Washington, D.C. Air Defense Identification Zone, ADIZ. When the comms operator relayed Riley's message on the overhead speaker, the entire command center went dead silent. Mitchell froze. The coffee mug in his hand tilted, spilling hot liquid onto the linoleum floor. He stared blankly at the radar track. Wraith. There was only one pilot in the history of the United States Air Force who held that call sign. Major Evelyn Reed. She was Mitchell's former wingman in Syria, a legendary electronic warfare specialist who had once flown a crippled F-22 Raptor through a grid of active surface-to-air missiles, using nothing but analog instruments and pure icy nerve. She had officially retired 2 years ago. "Colonel," the radar tech prompted, his voice trembling, "NORAD commander is on the red line. We need a go or no-go. The fighters are at bingo fuel for this intercept, and the target is accelerating." Mitchell grabbed the radio handset, his knuckles turning white. 01, this is Viper. Confirm you heard the call sign Wraith. Affirmative, Viper, Riley replied, the stress bleeding into his voice. Sir, I am 10 seconds from maximum effective range. I need authorization to fire. Mitchell didn't hesitate. 01, abort. I repeat, abort, intercept, safed weapons. Fall back to a 2-mile trail. Sir, the NORAD liaison shouted from across the bunker, throwing his headset down. That aircraft is 3 minutes from the capital. It is completely unresponsive to air traffic control. You cannot countermand a shoot-down order on a radio rumor. That is my plane now, Mitchell barked, his voice echoing off the concrete walls. If Evelyn Reed says she is in that cockpit, then she is in that cockpit. And if she's alive, that plane isn't going down without a fight. Patch me through to guard frequency. Now. A second later, the radio link crackled. Wraith, this is Viper. Are you actually sitting in the left seat of a civilian heavy right now? Inside the chaotic flight deck of Flight 772, Evelyn Reed leaned over the center pedestal, the microphone gripped tightly in her hand. The radar altimeter was flashing dangerously. They were descending through 18,000 feet, the nose pointed relentlessly toward the eastern seaboard. Negative, Viper, I'm standing behind the captain. Evelyn replied, her voice steady despite the violent rattling of the cockpit. We have a full digital lockout. Fly-by-wire is hijacked. Someone injected a 0-day worm into the avionics bus. It's flying a pre-programmed tactical profile, and it's overriding all manual yoke inputs. The pilots can't pitch, roll, or throttle down. Copy that, Wraith. Mitchell's voice came back, tight with anxiety. Listen to me closely. You are on a collision course with the D.C. restricted zone. I just bought you maybe 5 minutes before the Pentagon overrides me and sends a surface-to-air missile up your tailpipe. Can you regain control? Evelyn looked at the primary flight displays. The screens were locked, displaying spoofed data. The software is trapped in a closed loop. The primary flight computers are rejecting the physical disconnect switches. Can you pull the breakers? Mitchell asked. Captain Kessler already tried, Evelyn said, glancing at the sweating, terrified veteran pilot in the left seat. The hijackers anticipated it. The electronic breaker panel is fused. The malware is holding the relays closed digitally. There was a heavy pause on the radio. The hum of the massive GE-90 engines vibrated through the floorboards. Then you're a brick, Evelyn, Mitchell said softly, the grim reality settling in. If you can't cut the digital feed, you can't fly the plane. Evelyn's eyes darted across the overhead panel, staring at the complex grid of electrical switches. A crazy, reckless, entirely uncivilian idea began to form in her mind. It was a maneuver they used in electronic warfare combat to shed hostile lock-ons, but performing it on a 300-ton commercial airliner full of passengers was tantamount to suicide. Viper, Evelyn said, a terrifying calmness washing over her. You can't patch a hacked computer while it's plugged in. I need to starve it. Evelyn, what are you thinking? I'm going to kill the power. All of it. Captain Kessler spun around in his seat, his eyes wide with horror. Are you insane? If you shut down the main buses, we lose everything. We'll lose the engines, the hydraulics, the cabin pressure. We will literally drop out of the sky. Tell your fighters to give us some room, Viper, Evelyn said, ignoring the captain. It's about to get dark. She threw the radio microphone onto the console and reached up toward the overhead panel. Do not touch those switches. First Officer Hayes screamed, lunging across the center console to grab Evelyn's arm. Evelyn effortlessly blocked his arm, pinning his wrist to the throttle quadrant with a grip like a steel vice. She looked directly into Kessler's eyes. "Captain, look at your altimeter," she commanded, her voice cutting through the panic like a scalpel. "We are at 14,000 feet and diving at 3,000 feet per minute. In exactly 4 minutes, this aircraft is going to plow into a populated city block, or an F-35 is going to blow us to pieces. The computer is flying you to your death." Kessler stared at the relentless artificial horizon on his screen. His hands were still white-knuckling the useless yoke. "If we shut down the electrical system, the ram air turbine will drop," Evelyn continued rapidly. "The RAT will give us bare minimum hydraulics. When the primary flight computers lose all AC power, they will die. When they die, the malware dies. The fly-by-wire system will instantly revert to direct mode. It's a hard physical bypass. You'll have manual cables linked directly to the control surfaces." "It's never been done in flight," Kessler whispered, sweat dripping from his chin. "A cold reboot takes 3 minutes on the ground. We don't have 3 minutes of altitude. Then we fly it by the seat of our pants until it wakes up," Evelyn said. "You've been flying for 20 years, Captain. Do you want to die a passenger, or do you want to die a pilot?" Kessler stared at her for one agonizing second. Then, a fierce, desperate resolve hardened in his eyes. He let go of the yoke and reached for the overhead panel. "Ryan," Kessler barked at his first officer, his voice suddenly ringing with absolute authority. "Brace for negative Gs. Stand by on the RAT deployment monitor." Kessler's hands moved over the electrical panel. "Disconnecting left engine integrated drive generator. Now. Disconnecting right engine IDG. Now. APU generator. Off. Battery bus. Off." At exactly 2:38 a.m., Flight 772 died. The transition was violent and absolute. Inside the cabin, every single light extinguished simultaneously, plunging 280 passengers into pitch blackness. The soothing hum of the air conditioning ceased. The glowing seatback screens went entirely dark. A collective, deafening scream ripped through the fuselage. Clara Jenkins, the flight attendant, fell to her knees in the dark aisle, clutching the armrest of a terrified passenger. Outside, the 2 F-35s watched in disbelief as the massive Boeing 777 suddenly went entirely dark, its navigation lights, strobe lights, and cabin windows vanishing into the night sky. In the cockpit, the glass displays went completely black. The deafening roar of the wind rushing over the nose was the only sound left. Without the fly-by-wire system actively trimming the aircraft, the heavy nose of the Boeing immediately dropped. The dive accelerated instantly. Zero gravity hit the cabin. Passengers who weren't strapped tightly were lifted inches out of their seats. Evelyn grabbed the jump seat harness to anchor herself as the floor dropped away beneath her feet. "We are dark," Hayes yelled, over the roaring wind. Suddenly, a loud, heavy thump echoed from the belly of the plane. The ram air turbine, a small propeller designed to drop out of the fuselage into the slipstream during total power failure, had deployed. "RAT is deployed," Kessler shouted. "Hydraulic pressure is building. Give me the yoke, Ryan. Pull!" The digital malware was dead. The electronic shackles were broken. The flight controls had reverted to primitive, mechanical, direct mode. Kessler and Hayes both grabbed their yokes and pulled back with every ounce of physical strength they possessed. Without the computers assisting the hydraulics, moving the massive elevators on the tail of the 777 was like trying to steer a submarine with a canoe paddle. "Pull! Damn it! Pull!" Kessler roared, his face turning purple with exertion. Quote, the massive airframe groaned. The metal rivets screamed in protest under the immense aerodynamic load. In the dark cabin, oxygen masks deployed from the ceiling, dropping like dead spiders on the screaming passengers. Evelyn watched the backup analog altimeter, the only instrument running on the emergency battery. 10,000 feet, 8,000 feet, 6,000 feet. "She's too heavy," Hayes screamed. "The nose won't come up." "Trim her manually," Evelyn yelled, reaching over and furiously spinning the mechanical trim wheel on the center console. physically cranking the stabilizer to force the nose up. 4,000 feet. The G-forces hit them like a concrete wall as the aircraft finally began to respond to the physical inputs. The nose agonizingly began to rise. The terrifying view of the dark, starlit ocean rushing up to meet them slowly leveled out. At 2,400 feet, flying blindly through the dark, the Boeing 777 leveled off. Kessler was gasping for air, his arms trembling violently on the yoke. "We have pitch control," he wheezed. "Ryan, get the power back. Wake her up." Hayes reached up and slammed the standby power and battery switches back on. He reset the engine generators. Slowly, methodically, the Boeing came back to life. The glass screens flickered and illuminated. The primary flight displays booted up in safe mode. The digital compass swung into place. The cabin lights flickered on, revealing a sea of terrified, weeping, but very much alive passengers. "Avionics are back," Hayes cried out, tears streaming down his face. "Captain, we have clean control. The FMC is wiped. The malware is gone." Evelyn keyed the backup radio. "Viper, this is Wraith. The Ghost is dead. We have manual control of the Heavy. We are flying straight and level at 3,000 feet. In the Eads bunker, the room erupted. Technicians threw their headsets in the air, cheering and hugging each other. Colonel Mitchell slumped over the radar console, letting out a breath he felt like he had been holding for 10 years. "Solid copy, Wraith," Mitchell said, a massive grin breaking across his face. "Hell of a piece of flying. You scared the life out of us." "Wasn't me, Viper," Evelyn said, looking at the exhausted, heroic pilot sitting in the left seat. "I just turned it off and on again. Captain Kessler here did the heavy lifting." 01, this is Viper, Mitchell radioed the F-35s. "Escort Flight 772 to Andrews Air Force Base. Clear the airspace." "With pleasure, Viper," Lieutenant Riley replied. The two F-35s smoothly tucked in alongside the battered Boeing, their navigation lights blinking in a synchronized rhythm, guiding the massive airliner through the night sky toward the glowing lights of Washington, D.C., not as a weapon, but as a survivor. 30 minutes later, Flight 772 touched down on the expansive military runway at Andrews. Fire trucks and heavily armed tactical teams surrounded the aircraft the moment it came to a halt. The doors were breached, and FBI agents flooded the cabin, desperate to secure the aircraft and investigate the origin of the digital hijack. Clara Jenkins was standing by the forward galley, helping terrified passengers disembark down the emergency stairs. She turned to look for the woman in the leather jacket, the woman who had commandeered the cockpit and saved 280 lives. But Seat 4A was empty. In the chaos of the military response, Major Evelyn Reed had simply grabbed her duffel bag, flashed her JSOC credentials to a bewildered Air Force security guard on the tarmac, and vanished into the pre-dawn fog. She had a connecting flight to catch. Sometimes, the greatest heroes don't wear capes. They sit quietly in Seat 4A, waiting for the moment the world needs them. This pulse-pounding tale of survival proves that human courage and expertise can outmatch any machine. Did your heart stop during the dark drop? If you loved this intense, high-altitude thriller, smash that like button. Share it with your friends who love a good plot twist, and subscribe to the channel for more incredible stories.